Okay, so let's pick back up where we left off. Let's pick up there. Yeah, so we were just talking about how Buddhism's traveling to all these different parts of the world from the period of like 100 to 900, somewhere around that. So that's during the Tang Dynasty and kind of the start of the Song Dynasty. By the Song Dynasty, it's pretty well established. But so think about China encountering Buddhism for the first time. Before that, we'd had Confucianism, right? So we'd had Confucianism, and we had sort of the traditional nature religion and religion of the ancestors, and we'd had Taoism, which is this religion of the flow, the Tao. But we never had Buddhism before. So how is that going to change things? How are people going to react to that? These days we think of Buddhism as being such a, inherently Eastern, inherently Chinese and Japanese thing, but it really wasn't at the time. So how do you think people would have reacted when they encountered this new religion for the first time? This religion which basically said there's this problem in human life that we need to fix, which is our sort of suffering state where we are dissatisfied. And that's pretty different from everything that has come before in China. So yeah, think about comparing it to like Confucianism or Taoism. What are the differences going to be? Ideas that we're working with, and I wouldn't blame you if it's been a while since you thought about Taoism and Confucianism. Might be time to sort of recap it. But so what? Let's think. What were the big ideas of Confucianism and Taoism first off, and then how did that compare to Buddhism? So what would people have made of this sort of new set of ideas that was coming in? So yeah, Confucianism come up with by this guy named Confucius, and he had this idea of behaving like a gentleman, and that was his word for it. A certain kind of code of conduct. And what was the goal of this code of conduct? It was to do things in the right way to basically establish good things on earth. Rulers should treat the people they rule in the right way, and that's that old mandate of heaven idea, right? If you don't treat people the right way, you're thrown, and the gods will approve of it. For Confucius, it's even bigger. Husbands and wives should treat each other the right way. Fathers and sons, brothers, older brothers and younger brothers, friends, they should treat each other the right way. And sort of a you scratch my back, I scratch yours relationship. If everybody's positive towards each other in that way, that'll lead to good things. I think that's a pretty darn good philosophy in a lot of ways. Yeah, and so we looked at all the sort of different aspects of that previously, but a big one is taking care of your family, respecting your family a lot, and do unto others what you would do, what you would like others to do unto you, or to put it another way, don't do to other people what you wouldn't want other people to do to you. And there's also a lot of emphasis on ritual and sort of justice and things like that. So that's Confucian, a lot of this stuff previously. Now let's refresh on Taoism. So Taoism basically is this philosophy that the universe has a natural way, a way that you can kind of fall into, kind of like an athlete who like just gets really in the zone when they're running the ball down the field or something like that, or doing a gymnastics routine. They have to be totally in the moment. And Taoism encourages us to think about living that way all the time and being totally in the moment and following just sort of the natural, not getting caught up with all the sort of stuff that's in our heads, but just being in tune with our actions. We have all these sorts of ideas of being spontaneous and following the spontaneous way to happiness. So let's think about how that compares, to Confucianism, and also how that compares to Buddhism. Is of Buddhism one more time. Again, first noble truth is that we all experience this sort of dissatisfaction. Second noble truth is that we experience this dissatisfaction because we're attached to our fears and our desires. We're attached to things in the world that are only temporary and they're going to come and go. So we need to detach from the fears and desires and from the things like our possessions or our expectations of what we want from people, things like that. And that's truth number 3, is that when you let go of those attachments, then you start to become free from suffering. And then 4 is the Buddha's method for doing that, which he calls the Eightfold Path, which is like a set of different things you can do, ways you can live your life, kinds of meditation you can undertake, all this stuff surrounding the way to get out of this experience of suffering and achieve this state of freedom. And if everybody can get to that state of freedom, that's sort of the ultimate victory for Buddhists. So yeah, let's think about that. How would these different philosophies compare to each other? And maybe where would they be in conflict? Would there be conflicts coming out of that? Well, if we think about it, they're saying some different things. Like Buddhism is saying, use this very deliberate method to detach from suffering. And Confucianism is saying, use these very deliberate methods to work really hard and to do all these deliberate things to take care of people. And then Taoism is saying, oh, just go with the flow. And that's what leads to good things. So they're not completely different because they're all kind of human life in these various ways, and they all have interest in passion and taking care of people and things like that. But they go about it in some very different ways. And that did seem to lead to some conflict in China. I'll tell you about Buddhism first arriving in China. So it started taking root around the 400s, really. It was there earlier, but what they did is they started translating the Buddhist holy texts into good translations by people who knew both Sanskrit and or Pali, which is what they were originally written in, the language Pali, and Chinese. They knew all the languages to do a really good translation. And the sutras are those holy texts of Buddhism, the accounts of the Buddha's sermons and messages. And so by the time you get into the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism becomes more established, especially in the southern part of China. And one thing that's interesting is that there was certain compatibility. For instance, the Buddhists had this idea of bodhisattvas, these folks who just come back again and again to help other people achieve enlightenment. Well, the Taoists had this idea of these people called immortals. The immortals were people who had mastered the way, the flow, to such a degree that they had just sort of transcended their limitations and become immortal people who could do like magical things. And so that's pretty compatible. You can take somebody the Taoist says is an immortal, and the Buddhists can say that that person is a bodhisattva. And so that works pretty darn well. And then in the 600s, there's a notable visit from a Buddhist monk from India. No, sorry, a Buddhist monk from China, who goes back to India, check out the origin country, and brings back a lot of details, some more sutras, and sort of in general improves everybody's understanding of Buddhism. So that's pretty cool. But like I said, there was also conflict. There was a real clash between the current emperor of Tang China and the Buddhists. And there were some certain criticisms of Buddhism that he made. For instance, he thought it was very un-Chinese, and a lot of other people did too, that Buddha was an outsider. You might almost call him a barbarian. He was not a Chinese person, and so some people thought he was culturally, weird and different. And there were some logistical problems because the Buddhist monasteries, they were tax exempt. They didn't have to pay money to the government, and they owned a lot of land. And so at certain points, even though this was set up to be like a religion is cool and, we want to promote people being compassionate and things like that, that was the original idea. Certain emperors thought, well, why are we doing this? This is bad. The Buddhists shouldn't enjoy this special status. They should, pay their taxes like everybody else. And then there's some weird things. Like, for instance, Buddhists, they tend to like to be celibate, right? They tend to like to go off and be monks in the forests, in their monasteries, and be isolated and sort of separate from day-to-day life. Whereas Confucians are all about family. It's pretty weird for a Confucian if you're somebody who doesn't want to have kids. That's an odd thing. And also it's weird to detach from, your parents and to sort of go off and do something on your own, do your own kind of thing. That's uncomfortable. And so it's like, are these Buddhists, doing something wrong? Are they doing something bad? That's the feeling. And in general, Buddhists are very much about sort of moving away from the world in a lot of ways, or at least about changing the world by, coming up with something that's totally different. Buddhists aren't supposed to be invested in day-to-day life. They're supposed to be doing their own separate project of trying to become enlightened. And Confucians are all about day-to-day life. It's like, take care of the business, take care of the farms, stuff like that. So that's weird to Confucians as well. But the Emperor Wuzong promoted Taoism and Confucianism, but he persecuted outside religions like Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, which I mentioned last when we were talking about the Persians. It's still pretty popular. It made its way all the way to China, this sort of dualistic religion of the god of light and the god of darkness. But Emperor Wuzong didn't like that very much either. But I think Wuzong's in the minority. Buddhists become more and more respected over time. And there sort of comes along, I'll move my window here so you can see, this comparative religion type of thinking. And so different people from the different religions start to think about, how do they relate to each other? And one famous painting depicts a story of the three masters of the religions as having these three different sets of ideas. And see if you can guess which one the maker of the art is promoting here. The first, there's three men, and they're the three founders of the religions, and they're all sitting around a vat of vinegar, and they're all tasting it. And Confucius, he tastes it, and he thinks it's wine, and he says, "This wine is too sour. We must sweeten it. We have to improve it." And the Buddha tastes the vinegar, and he says, "This wine is bitter. We should avoid it, and stop drinking this terrible wine," basically. And then Lao Tzu is the only one who recognizes that it's actually vinegar. And he says, "Oh, this is great vinegar. It's very sweet, and I love it. We don't need to change it. It's great as it is." And so this is a story told by a Taoist who would be following the teachings of Lao Tzu. And the argument they're making is that Lao Tzu accepts the world as it is. This is the Taoist. They're going with the flow. Whereas Confucius thinks you have to fix the world by tidying it up and improving it. And the Buddha thinks you have to move away from the world and go off and be separate and be a monk. And they're making the argument that Lao Tzu has the right idea. You don't need to improve it. It's already great. So that's a good, way of thinking about these three different traditions here. And it shows that people were thinking about the differences. But we also found ways of people unifying them as well. And I want to talk about one of my favorite examples is a story that unifies Buddhist and Confucian ideas. So one of the things is that, the Buddhists tend to practice this interest in family as much, more traditionally. And the Confucian. So this is a story that actually into the context of Buddhism. So like in Hinduism, there's a concept in Buddhism that we translate as hells, basically these realms of sort of evil. Not quite like our concept of hell, but sort of like that. And the idea is, in Hinduism and Buddhism, if you've led a bad life, you might be reincarnated negatively as this kind of ghost or a monster in this hell realm. So you're reincarnated in a bad place where everyone's bad, and you're reincarnated as some sort of gross monster. So that is the way in Buddhism that you could, quote, go to hell. And this is a story that comes along in the Tang dynasty, is that there's this Buddhist monk named Mulian. And Mulian's mother, she led a bad life, and when she died, she was reincarnated into one of these hells. And because this guy was such a good Buddhist monk, he was able to uncover the secrets of the universe, and he realized that his mother was in hell. And when he found out, what he did was he basically staged a rescue mission, more or less. He got a whole bunch of Buddhist monks to pray for her and to, send this sort of divine energy and this bodhisattva energy to make sure that she could reincarnate into a better form and basically be saved from hell. And she says, "Thank you, my loyal son." So this is a story in which a Buddhist gets to be loyal to his mother. And see, that was really satisfying for these Chinese audiences, that the Buddhist could still, have his Buddhist mission, but also really care a lot about his family and show that he was a good son, in addition to being a monk. So I think it's pretty interesting. We're seeing those ideas coming together. And it's still a very popular story today in a lot of plays and operas and things. Okay, we're going to pick back up on this subject in the next video when we look at some art.